Okay, so in this video, I'm going to take you through a practical example of how to convert your 3D models ready for a GLB. So first thing first, we have a model in our in Blender, and we need to basically take this to GLB. The goal that we have in mind is to make this as optimized as we can while making it look good as well. Now this is a model that I created, so it has a lot of like modifiers on this. So each part has its own different sets of modifiers that I can choose to apply or not apply. If you're using an already made model, this might not be the case. It might not have the modifiers tag list. Those might already be applied, but I'll show you a workaround for those as well. So first thing first, before we begin, let's just export the file as it is and see what happens when we just export it out. Right now, all of these are using Blender's internal shaders. You can see that they are like combining different values to give us what we need, right? So what happens if I just export this out as it is and just make the upload it on my website or something as a product or whatever I want? So let me just export this file. Right now this is a 16 MB file, and let's see what happens if we just load this in. Okay, this does not look anything like what we saw in Blender, and there are these weird white lines that Blender, right? So we need to do a series of steps before we can export this model out. Okay, so let's start with this video. First off, I'm going to name this model high. So this is my high poly model, and I'm just going to duplicate this entire collection. So I have the original if I need to go back, and then I have the low version as well. So let me just name this. So you can name this model low or model optimized version, so you would know which one is the high version and which one is the low version. Okay. So first thing, we need to see what our currently our count is, poly count is for our model. And to do this, we need to enable our statistics. So right now there are 130K triangles, vertices, and 250K triangles, right? That's too much for this kind of detail. Again, it's good to have this if you're rendering it out. It looks more crisp model, but this is not something that we want for our web flow, right? So first thing that I'm gonna go is see which modifiers are not necessary and just turn them off. So for example, the subdivion is right now set to 1. Let's see what happens if I turn this all the way down to 0. Right, I'm noticing some slight difference, but again, if it's not visually impacting your model too much, it's fine. This can be removed. Now, as soon as I turn this on and off, you can see the model drops from 132 vertex count to about 98K. Right, so let's just remove this all the way. Now, in your case, let's say you don't have the option for subdivision. It was already applied, and now your model is extremely dense, something like this, right? There are two ways we can fix this. First is we go in manually and just remove the edge loops that we don't need. This, in some cases, this is the best option that we can do. In other options, fast way of doing this is to just use a decimate modifier. Now, a lot of people struggle with decimate modifier is because they add one decimate and they just turn it way down. If you do this, your model is going to start losing its information. So what I say is always use decimate modifier in increments. So basically, I would use one decimate modifier and I would take it about 0.5, and I would see if it's affecting my model too much. Okay, it's not affecting too much. Then I would duplicate this, right? And then I would see if this is affecting my model too much. Okay, over here, we are getting some issues. Okay, but I think they can be ignored, or let's just crank up the value. So instead of 0.5, let's make it 0.7. Okay, that's fine. Right, and we can duplicate this as many times as we need, as long as it doesn't affect the mesh. You can see as soon as it starts affecting the mesh, I either remove it or I just don't add it. Now doing this, we have gotten close to what we got originally. We are like a few thousand higher number, but still we are very close to our original number, which is fine. Right, so if you have subdivision applied, just use this method. If you don't have subdivision applied, that's like the best situation you can get, and you can just remove the subdivision modifier. Now that that's done, I'm gonna basically do this for all the other objects. I'm just gonna go on each of these objects and turn off this subdivision if it's not affecting the model too much. Okay, for now I'm not going to apply the mirror modifier, and I'll tell you the reason for this later. Usually whenever you look at solidify modifier on your model, a lot of times you don't need the backside, right? Because that's not going to be visible. So I usually have this only rim selected. So basically if I go to solid view, you can see it only adds the rim, it doesn't add the full model. Again, that just saves some vertex count. So if with only rim I'm getting 170 triangles or 101 vertices, with this without the rim, if the entire mesh is filled in, we are getting 280 triangles and 142 vertices. Again, the more you can save, the better you're going to get a more optimized model. Okay, this is a Boolean object, so let me just move this to extra. Okay, so the objects whose modifiers I've applied, I usually just press H to hide them because I don't want them to be constantly in my view. Let's apply this. Okay, again, I'm not going to apply the mirror modifier for now. I'm keeping it as it is. I'm only going to apply solidify. Okay, so over here, now this is a case where you do need to apply subdivision. With subdivision, you can see the circle is much smoother. Without the subdivision, it's fine, but usually you don't want your products to be like this. Like, it's better. I like this version much more than I like this version. Right, in this case I would apply the subdivision modifier, and I would go into edit mode and just do a manual cleanup. So I would see which of the vertices are not necessary. So for example, this and this, they are not doing anything, they are not preserving the shape in any way. So I can just go select these edges by alt and left clicking, and then X to dissolve these edges. You can see it didn't affect the mesh too much. Well, it didn't affect it at all. Now let me go into isolated view and let me see if I can find some other one. So for example, this one, again, they're not doing anything specific. The underneath the side is deleted. Again, that's not something that's going to be visible. The rest are, I think, necessary, so we can keep them as it is. Okay. I think this can be filled. Yeah. And let me just make this straight. So whenever you want to flatten out your model, just press SZ0 to flatten it out. I want to make it flat using this vertex, so I'm just going to select it, go to active element, and then SZ0 to flatten it out. Okay, and let me just dissolve this. Now I can also make this sharp, so if I press Ctrl E and go to mark sharp, this is just going to give it a sharp shading. I also need to enable my auto smooth for this to be visible. Right, and I can crank up this value. So now this bottom part, this is a very sharp transition. Again, I can bevel this very slightly if I need. And let's remove the sharp. Yeah, so this is much better. Again, when you don't like the result of removing your subdivision, you can apply your subdivision and then just clean up manually. Right, so once this is done and I'm happy with this mesh, I can just hide this. Okay, so now that this is done, I'm happy with the model. I can start baking my materials. First thing, let's start with the body. I'm going to move this up. So basically, when you're deciding on how many materials you need, the thing that you need to keep in mind is how many materials you want your model to be divided into, right? And just take a, like, you can just do an estimate. It doesn't have to be exact. So for example, let's say this body, these control parts, they don't have a lot of detail, so I can basically bake them into like one texture. And then models such as these that have stickers on them, these do need higher like area to work properly, and in these cases it's better if I basically bake them with like a greater area inside of the UV map. So first thing first, let's select our model and then let's add seam to the areas that are inside. So let me just go in and add seams to these inner grooves. So whenever you're doing UV mapping, just visualize it as you're basically creating a 2D cutout version of your model. So you just need to add seams in areas that are not visible that much, so you don't get those seam issues. Okay, so once I'm done with the UV unwrap, just make sure you go to UV and average island scale. It basically scales up your islands according to how big your model is over here, and then I just need to place it correctly inside of my UV texture. So I need to make sure none of the parts are overlapping with each other, and I also have enough covering for my UVs for the textures to bake. I prefer to do this part manually, but of course you can also do this automatically if you select everything and you press go to UV and just back islands. It does this automatically, but usually I don't like the results of it. I like to do it manually, so I have much more control over it. Either way is completely fine as long as you get good enough results. To make sure that you're getting good results, you can just create a UV grid texture or a color grid texture, whichever you would prefer, and hit OK, and then switch to your solid view and change this to texture. And then over here in my image, I'm just going to open up the image that I've just created. Let me increase the tiling of this. Oh, okay. So basically over here I can see I can properly see the alphabets, so it's fine. If for example you're in this kind of case where your grid is much bigger over here than the rest of the parts, that means this area has lower resolution than the rest of your model. As long as your grids are equally divided, that means your model is completely fine. Okay, so I think this is good enough. Let's go back and let's add something else to this. So I think we can add these bases. Let me just see. Yeah, let's add this base. So again, I'm just going to select this by pressing L and then U to Smart UV project. We don't have to add seams in this case. Okay, so whenever you get this error that your object has no uniform scale, that just means you need to apply scale. So just select your object, Control A, apply scale. Now hit in edit mode, U to unwrap, so you get a proper unwrap. And then I can just scale this down and place it anywhere I see it fitting. Okay, now let me go in and see if there are any smaller parts that we can add in this UV. So I think we can add these screws as well. So let me just go in, unwrap these and scale them down. Let me just place them outside for now. We can add this. So metallicness is the only exception in this case, since we don't have an option by default to bake our metallic maps. So usually what I do is just take this input, whatever is going into metallic, and just plug that in inside of our main shader, and I'll do this for each of these. Okay, so only one material is using a texture for metal, so I'm just going to plug that in into base color, and then I'm just going to bake my diffuse. Make sure your correct texture is selected in each of these materials, since I just did change them. Okay, and now I can do. And these pink colors that we have over here, we can just replace them with black color, since metallic in metallic maps, black means that it's not a metallic and white means that it is a metal. So if you want your buttons to be metal, you can choose a value between white and gray, and for the black parts you can just like use a solid black color. Unfortunately for now, this is the way it needs to be done, because there is no other way to do this other than like using add-ons. But for now, this is how I do it, and then I can just plug this back into base color. And now that we have all of our maps baked, there is one extra one that I usually like to do, and that's going to be our combined map. And basically what this does, it combines all of your diffuse, normal, emission, whatever you're using, all of those with the lighting of your scene, and it just gives your model a, like, the lighting, shadows, all of those things are baked inside of a diffuse shader. And the reason why I like this is because it has a lot of times when you export to a GLB file, you're not getting the crispy, you're not getting the details that you're looking for. They get erased. So it's because in Blender we are using HDRIs. Like by default there are some HDRI that are added to our scene that makes the lighting basically pop. In our case, we need to add some sort of HDRI to make it work properly. So what I'm going to do is go over here, environment texture, and then just download an HDRI. Okay, now in our material preview, we need to change this from default to scene light and scene world, so we can see how our HDRI is affecting our mesh, and we can increase and decrease the strength of our HDRI. So basically, I don't want it too strong, but I also don't want it too dim, so I'm just going to lower the strength a little bit, and then I can add some additional lights, like some area lights or whatever you would prefer to use, just so I can get some sort of like equally lit model from all sides. Again, it doesn't need to be super lit, just enough that you can see the shadow. So for example, this is a good level of detail. Let me lower the intensity a little bit more. Okay, I think about here is fine. And then I'm going to add it all around my model, so it's like being lit from all of the sides. Again, you can mess around with the intensity of the lights depending on which area you're lighting and how much you want it to be lit. Okay. Okay, so once I have something decent enough, I'm going to select all of these. So first, let me just go in, select all of my lights and move them to a new collection, and let me just name this lights. Okay. Now let me just uncheck this for now, select all of these, check the lights, and now I can go over here and bake my combine texture. Again, make sure you have the correct texture selected. Okay, now we can go to our bake and just bake this. Oh, since we have lights also selected, it's not letting us bake, so I'm only going to select all of these objects and then bake again. This usually takes longer than the other textures, but as long as the resolution is not too high for your textures, it will be fine. Okay, so here we can see we have all of these texture baked, and now we can see all of these different shadow and other details on our model, right? So this is a very usable texture, and we'll use it in conjunction with our diffuse map. So I'm just going to name this. Okay, so far we have done our first main material, so I'm just going to turn this off for now and then open the extra one. Oh, okay, so I'm going to open up my my low model, and now I'm going to bake the rest of these which have not been baked yet. So okay, so if you see some weird textures just because we're in texture mode, just change this to material preview, and then you'll be able to see your models how they should look. Okay, so now over here I can decide which of these needs bigger spaces and which of these need smaller spaces. So anything that has logo, something written on it, or like some sort of engravings on it, of course those need to be bigger in UV spaces, and items that do not have a lot of detail, they can be smaller. It doesn't really matter. Let me just delete this extra part over here. Okay, now what we're going to do is let's first do the big parts, and then if we have some space remaining we can do the other parts. Now in this case we have to do our approach should be a little different, and the reason for this is because it's already using a UV map. You can see if I go into UV map, go to use smart UV project, it's going to basically deform my existing UV. So we need to retain that while we bake our model. And to do this, you need to go to your object data properties, and then over here under UV map, create a new UV map. Right, this new UV map, this can be our default, and this can be our new. Now I'm going to bake whatever detail I'm baking onto this new UV map. And the way that we can do this is just make sure that when you're baking, before you click on the bake button, you have this selected over here. Now I'm going to do this for each of these buttons. Okay, now I can go in and like unwrap it again. So use, okay, U and then unwrap. So this is my first button. Okay. So once these are done, I'm also going to do this to the other parts. Okay, so anytime we get this error that object has no uniform scale, that means we need to go into object mode and apply the scale of our object, right? And if we get this dark shading, we need to go into edit mode, select this, and press Ctrl Shift N to invert our normals. Okay, now I can just unwrap this and place it over here. Again, how big I want is really dependent on what the resolution of my textures are. If the resolution of your texture is like 4K or 8K, you can make this a lot smaller and it wouldn't matter. But in my case, since I'm using 2K textures, I think this is fine. Okay, so in this case, I already have 2 UV maps. And if I go to the second UV map and I just unwrap this again, it distorts this pattern. So again, this might be the material that I'm using is using 2 UV maps. So what I'm going to do is create a third UV map and then just bake this over here. Okay, now let's see if we can fit in these as well. Okay, so in this case, I'm again getting this error of this, the UV scale is not consistent, even though the scale is set to 111. So what I'm going to do is isolate this rim, just hide this for now and only unwrap this part because this is the part that has a letter on it. So let me just place it over here. Okay, and then I can press Alt S to bring that back and unwrap this again. And using my UV squares add-on, I can just set this to grid by shape. Right, and now I can just scale this down. Okay, now let's do the same thing over here. Okay, once this is also placed, let's move on to some other object. Now only these two are remaining, so let's do these. Now I think we can just name this buttons, and this will be our like basically second material. So let me just name this mat 2. Okay, now let me just disable this for now, and over here let's go to our each of these materials and basically add in our texture that we're going to bake onto. I'm going to use the texture that we have been using so far. It's fine if you create a new one, and it's also fine if you rewrite the same old one. It doesn't really matter. The only thing that like makes a difference is, so for example, when I start baking, I don't want it to have this old texture over here. So what I do is select one of these objects and then set this to clear image, and for now let me set this to diffuse, and let me just bake this. Right, so now we have this empty material and it has the information baked on it, and you can see it wipes the image clean. Now let me just disable this, and now I can select the rest of the objects and have them all bake. But first thing I need to do is just add my texture in each of these. So let me just copy and paste this. Okay, now the rest of the procedure is very similar to what we did before. It's just baking each of these materials separately. So I'm going to speed through this process. It's basically the same thing we already did. The only difference in this case was creating a new UV map. So I'll just tune in once all the baking is done. Okay, so now once all the baking is done, I can start importing all of my materials inside of this and start attaching different materials and textures. So first thing that we need to do is duplicate our collection, and this is just so we have the original version over here. Now let me just name these properly. So this should be material 2 button 1. Now I'm going to select all of these and go into my local view, and basically now I can go to my material properties, remove this material, create a new material. Let's name this material 2 buttons. Okay, now just make sure you have node wrangler enabled. So go to your add-ons and enable node wrangler if you don't have it enabled, and if you do, you just need to click this so it's white, and then press Ctrl Shift D, and then you can go to your textures folder, and here you can find the correct texture. So right now I'm searching for material 2 buttons. I need diffuse, emissive, normal, roughness, and metallic. So I'll just select all of these, click on principal texture setup, and it's automatically going to set it up. The only problem is right now it's not using the correct UV, so we're going to go to our data properties tab and just remove all of these extra UVs that we don't want. Now once this is done, I'm going to select all of my objects by pressing A, and then with Ctrl L I can link all of the materials. So now all of these objects are using the same material. I just need to go and delete these UVs. Okay, now for the most part your material should be looking fine. If it's not, usually the only thing that I mess around with is the specular. So sometimes it's way too much for some objects, so I usually like to just tone it down because I already have everything baked in. I don't really need a very strong specular. You can adjust it according to whatever project you're working on. Once this is done, now I can go back to my original model. Now let's go to mat 1 and then isolate this. Same process, let's just remove the materials, create a new one, name this mat 1, and let me just add in all of my textures. And let me just reduce the specular down. Now same thing, Control L and link my materials. Okay, now I'm gonna go back to my view, go to material 3 and repeat the same process again. Okay. Now basically we have our model set up. Now if I export this out, it should work properly as a GLB file. So I'm going to make sure it's selected objects, then go to mesh, apply modifiers, just in case it is using any modifiers, disable shaky, disable skinning, because we don't have any armature or any animation. And then for my compression, it's up to you if you want to turn this on. It just lowers your file size. Also, if you save your textures in JPEG, that also reduces the file size by a lot. I think by default, when you export as a GLB, it automatically converts them to JPEG. But it's like okay, even if you do this. Okay, now I'm going to drag and drop in my file. Okay, and now we can see we got a material that looks exactly how we would want it to look, and all the materials are supported. And basically you can go ahead and mess with any of the settings if you want. So for example, right now the roughness is too strong on this one. If I want to lower it down, that's something I can edit in my textures. You can also change your HDRI to get an idea of how it looks. But basically now we are able to see our textures the same way that it looks inside of Blender.